If you're a lifter who's ever dealt with an injury or you're currently dealing with an injury and you've gone through the rehab process, whether that's through working with a physical therapist, a chiropractor, another healthcare provider, or just rehabbing on your own, then you know how frustrating flare-ups and setbacks can be. You've probably dealt with that injury for quite a long time. It was really affecting your training, and you eventually decide that you want to do something to overcome it, whether that was working with the healthcare provider or just rehabbing on your own. And like most people, things were probably going pretty well in the beginning. You were making progress, having less pain, seeing improved performance and confidence in the gym, and you were moving in the right direction. And unfortunately, like what happens with the vast majority of people, is at some point you had a flare up or a setback. You started to have more pain, you weren't able to do as much in the gym, and you feel like you're sliding backwards even compared to what you were doing a few days or a few weeks ago. And that can be really hard to deal with and just really frustrating, especially when you've finally been seeing that progress happen for a while and you feel like you're on the right track. It can be pretty demoralizing to have a flare up happen. And that's why I'm making this video. So today's video is going to be all about what flare ups are, why they happen, what to do and what not to do when you're dealing with a flare up, in the hopes that we can help teach you actually what to do and how to overcome these obstacles when they do happen in your training and rehab journey. So first things first is that flare-ups are incredibly common. The vast majority of people who are rehabbing an injury or trying to get back to full training will have one or more flare-ups during the course of that rehab process over time. It's a lot less common to just have this completely linear progression in your rehab and function and pain, where you start the rehab process, you feel better, move better, train better day after day, week after week, until you're 100%. It's much more common to have this little up and down graph where you have good days, you have bad days, you're making progress, you have setbacks or flare-ups, but the overall trend is moving in the right direction over time. And that is what 99 plus probably percent of lifters experience when they are rehabbing an injury. It's a bit more of a bumpy road. It's not that linear progress that we're all hoping and looking for. And because of that, it's really important to know what to do and what not to do when you are experiencing a flare-up, because so many people do have them. So ultimately, to put this in simple terms, flare-ups happen because of one main reason. We have our capacity and our stress. Our capacity is basically what our body is ready to handle at that point in time. And this is made up of a bunch of different factors, from your training history, life stress, how well you're sleeping and eating and recovering. And all these factors go into what your body can handle at a given point in time. And then there is your stress. And there are many different forms of stressors. We have physical stress from lifting and training and the activities that we do at work and at home and with our kids and friends and all these other physical demands that we have. And then there are life stressors with work, relationships, all these sorts of things, and also mental and emotional stressors. And all of these different stressors basically combine, and that is what the total stress that we experience at that point in time. And the interplay between our capacity and our stress is really what dictates the pain and injuries that we have, how they progress, what our risk factors are for them, and also this thing with flare-ups. What ultimately happens is when our capacity exceeds our stress, so what we can handle at any given point in time is more than the stress that we're placing on our bodies or what we're subjecting our bodies to, then we're in the clear. Things are usually good. We're not experiencing a lot of pain. Our risk for injury is pretty low. And ultimately, we don't really have many, if any, flare-ups. On the other hand, when your stress exceeds your capacity, that is not so great. So when your physical, mental, and emotional stress combine and exceed what your body can handle at that point in time, that is when these flare-ups tend to happen. That's when pain typically is worse and your risk of injury is higher. And what's really important to discuss is the overall contributors or factors involving pain, because there are so many things that affect pain and affect this type of stress that we have in our body. And most people think that pain is just a reflection of the health or status of the tissues in our body. So most people think that pain equals tissue damage, and the level of pain that you have is indicative of the level of tissue damage that you have, where you have more tissue damage equals more pain. And when you have less tissue damage, that equals less pain. And that's not necessarily true, because just like our capacity and our stress, there are many different factors that go into pain itself. We definitely do have the tissue damage and irritation side of things, where things like ligament strains, bone stress injuries, inflammation, all these physical factors do play a big part in pain and flare-ups and injury. And then we have all these other factors as well. And I really like this image because it shows just how intricate the concept of pain and injuries are, and all of these factors that can contribute to what we're experiencing. We have the central sensitization, so our nervous system, how like heightened it is, how sensitized we are, how much we're stressing about our pain or injury, all these other factors that go into our nervous system. We have beliefs and cultural phenomenon when it comes to pain. If we believe that pain is always a bad thing and that anytime we have pain we're doing harm, that's going to really shape what we're experiencing and our response to these flare-ups, and how likely we are to have a flare-up and how significant those flare-ups can be. And then we have other biological factors like your age, your BMI, and all these different variables, physical, mental, and social, that all kind of come together to dictate what our pain is like, if we have pain, how much pain we have, all these sorts of things. So again, that is just a very long-winded way of saying that there's a lot of different factors that go into pain, and therefore a lot of different factors that go into flare-ups. And that is one of the reasons why flare-ups are so common, because all of these factors can contribute to it. And I kind of break down the 4 really big factors or big categories that we see when it comes to pain and injuries and flare-ups. Those are training load changes, life stressors, accumulated fatigue, and fear and hypervigilance. When we look at it this way, get rid of those. When we're rehabbing an injury, we're obviously still trying to train during that rehab process, as I've spoken about in other videos. And because of that, we have to modify and then progress these different variables like the volume, intensity, frequency, the variation of the exercise, the range of motion of the exercise, and all these other factors that go into our training itself. And as we're progressing these different variables, we have to gradually move them forward over time and push them higher and higher until you're back to 100%. And when you're trying to progress these, there is the chance that we might progress things a little bit too aggressively, or we might have other things going on at the same time as we're trying to progress these variables, and that can lead to a little bit of a flare-up. We also have life stressors like high work or high stress work environments, arguments with families, spouses, significant others, a lot of travel, all these other things that happen in our life that add stress to the system. We also have accumulated fatigue. This is what happens gradually over time as we're going through a training and rehab program, and we're making things harder and harder to progress you forward. But sometimes that fatigue can accumulate over time, especially if it's not well modulated, and it can cause a flare-up. And this is especially true if you're having poor sleep, poor nutrition, if you're training too close to failure too often, and you don't have any deloads when things aren't starting to feel good, or any pivots in the program. Not that you have to deload every 4 to 6 weeks automatically or anything like that, but if you see a current trend where things are starting to not feel so great, you're not recovering as well, and you just keep on trying to push forward, you're going to accumulate way more fatigue than you can probably handle, and that's when this is going to flare up and cause an exacerbation of your pain and symptoms. And lastly is fear and hypervigilance. And this is something that's not talked a lot about, but is very common in a lot of the lifters I work with. It's very common, especially if you're dealing with a significant pain or injury or something that's been going on for quite a long time, to develop some fear and like anxiety and what we call hypervigilance around the pain that they're feeling, around the movement that they got hurt with, all these sorts of things. And this can increase the sensitivity of your nervous system. It can increase that mental stress that you're feeling. reduce your confidence with your training and in your body and with your injury. And those can all lead to flare-ups as well. So, let's get out of that. So next is one of the really important things to discuss when it comes to flare-ups, and that is what flare-ups don't mean. And this is something that I go over with a lot with my own clients, because a lot of us have these false beliefs where a flare-up means that you've done more structural damage, you've irritated your tendon or your disc or your muscle or whatever injury you have to a greater degree. A lot of people can feel like they just like erased all the progress and they're now back to square one. A lot of people might feel that when they're having or going through a flare-up, that they need to fully rest, stop training, stop all the rehab work that they're doing, and just give themselves time to reset. And a lot of people also think that they may have done permanent harm and that they'll never be able to get back on track and start working their way back to 100% again. And luckily, pretty much all those things are untrue. Flare-ups, for the many reasons that we talked about before, don't necessarily mean that you've done more structural damage. It could be you've had really bad sleep and nutrition for a couple days in a row. You've had a lot more life stressors. You haven't managed training intensity and volume well as you've been progressing it. And any of those things can ultimately lead to a flare-up. It also doesn't mean that you're back to square one, even if you've had a bad flare-up and the pain feels quite significant, quite severe. It's very rare that means that you're actually back to where you started initially when you started to rehab this injury. Most people will find that even though the pain is pretty severe, they can still handle a decent amount of training, and that's likely more than what they're doing when they first started to rehab their injury. For example, I had a client of mine who was dealing with back pain for months and months and months, and it was so bad that he could barely squat 135 pounds. And we were rehabbing his injury. He was doing really well for the first 2 months, just making very solid, steady progress. And in that third month, towards the end of the second month rather, we kept on pushing his volume intensity slowly but surely. But he had a lot of life stuff come up, a lot of travel for the holidays, a lot of like work stress, end of year type stuff. And he ended up developing a flare-up of his back pain. And it was pretty bad. Like initially he was like nearly couch bound or bed bound for the first day. And he told me that he felt like he was back at square one. And luckily, after that first day, we started to get him moving more. We got him back in the gym, but modified things. And he found that he wasn't back at square one, luckily. He was still able to train, not with as heavy load as what we had been doing before his flare-up, but it was still significantly heavier and more training than what he was doing when we first started to work together. So just that mental reframe of, even though it might feel like really significant or really severe symptoms and might feel like you're back at square one, that's hardly the actual case. Another thing is you really don't need full rest. When dealing with most, if not the vast majority of pain and injuries, full rest is rarely ever a good long-term answer because one, you probably don't need to rest that much in order to have the pain calm down. And two, just completely resting can actually make things worse in the long run because you become detrained and your capacity to handle training is lower. Most times you just need to modify a little bit around the flare-up and then start progressing again, and you're typically good to go. And the last is that they feel like they've done permanent harm, and that's simply not true. Most flare-ups are relatively short-lived periods of increased symptoms because of an increased overall level of stress to the system. And it doesn't mean that things are permanently damaged or harmed or anything like that. Now, what to do when a flare-up does happen is arguably the most important part of this. So number one is do not panic. Again, just knowing that these are very common and not the end of the world or anything like that can go a long way in helping to mitigate how significant or severe that flare-up is. Number two is to modify your training. And this is the bread and butter of dealing with a flare-up, just like it is dealing with and rehabbing an injury in general. So when you're dealing with a flare-up, you want to further modify things like the intensity, the volume of lifting and exercise that you're doing, the tempo that you're using, the range of motion that you're training through, and the variation of the exercise that's causing the flare-up and symptoms, and find ways to tweak those and modify those so that you can get down to like a 3 to 4 out of 10 level of symptoms chill out there for a little while, and then slowly start making progress again back to where you were before the flare up. That modification and progression process is really what actually helps resolve injuries, resolve flare ups, and get you back to where you want to be. Next is to zoom out. And this really means kind of looking at the big picture of what's been going on. So if you go back to that little graph in the beginning, what's really common is we're training, we're going through this process, and then we have a flare up and we feel like we're down here again. And it feels really bad because we're lower than we were before. We've had a setback and all sorts of stuff. But if you zoom out, you can see that where you were now is still light years ahead of where you were before. And just going through that process of actually kind of like zooming out, looking at the bigger picture, can really help to calm things down and build up your confidence that you're making progress, doing the right things again. And lastly, is to slowly build back up. And just like you wouldn't go from squatting 135 to 225 without any steps in between or increases in load in between, you also don't want to modify your training in the presence of a flare-up, and then when things are starting to feel better, just jump right back to what you're doing prior to the flare-up. That sudden spike in training volume and intensity will very likely set off another flare-up. So you want to slowly and gradually, over the course of a couple days or a couple weeks, depending upon the severity of your flare-up and how long it's been lasting, build back up to 100% and really let your symptoms be your guide. If you're progressing your training in the presence of a flare-up and it's feeling better and the symptoms aren't increasing, then it's safe to keep on pushing. If you start progressing back to where you were before the flare-up and after a little while you start to notice that symptoms are coming back a little bit more, they're becoming a little bit more frequent, then you know that you might want to step on the brakes a little bit, kind of like stay where you are or pull back a little bit, wait for things to calm down a little bit more, and then slowly build up again. And all of this stuff is like really showing why navigating flare-ups alone can be such a challenging thing to do. And the main reason is because it's just hard to stay objective when you're the one dealing with the flare-up, feeling the pain, having that loss of function and confidence in the gym. That stuff is really hard to deal with. I've dealt with my own fair share number of injuries in my training career. And even as a physical therapist, like I know what to do. I do this for work. I've worked with hundreds of lifters to help them navigate injuries and flare-ups in the rehab process. When I'm going through it, it's still tough to do for myself because I'm the one dealing with the pain. I'm the one having those doubts and that stress and anxiety. And that's one of the reasons why some of my clients are other physical therapists who love lifting but are dealing with their own injuries. It's because they know that they can't really stay objective with what's going on and make the best decisions for themselves. And they need somebody else to help them through this process. And that's why having a good coach or a provider can be a really big game changer in like successfully rehabbing an injury, but especially when you're going through a flare-up, because that person can be that source of objectivity. They can be that like third-party perspective to really get a good understanding of what's going on, make level-headed decisions, and help you navigate that flare-up and get out of it as safely, effectively, and quickly as possible. And that's a big part of what I do with my own clients. These two examples here are messages that I've received from clients that I was working with who were doing great, and then they had a flare-up. And initially they would have like panicked and just stopped lifting, stopped training. They would have gotten in the heads thinking that they've done irreparable damage and that they wouldn't be able to get back to where they wanted to be. And through us talking through it, through us working together and modifying the program accordingly, they were able to get out of those flare-ups a lot easier with a lot less stress and a lot more like quickly than they had prior. And learning how to manage those flare-ups safely and effectively as they did is one of like the biggest turning points that a lot of my clients have. Like developing that confidence and that knowledge and like knowing that things might flare up, things might kind of go bad for a little bit, but knowing that you know what to do and can handle it confidently and effectively is a really big source of independence for the lifters I work with. And it can be honestly like game changing for them. So that was a lot about flare-ups, kind of what they are, what they aren't, how to navigate them, all that sort of stuff. I hope I hope that this was helpful. And if you're dealing with your own injury and you want to rehab it and get back to lifting heavy and get back to doing all the things that you love doing, and you know that you want help with it, or you think you may need help with it, then just click the link below and schedule a free phone consult with me and my team, and we'll see if we can help you out.